Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flach.
For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. That is Jeremiah 29:11. I always love that verse. It reminds me that God has a plan for every one of our kids with trauma histories and prenatal exposure. Of course, He has a plan for us. Yes, God has a plan, a hope, and a future for our kids. So encouraging, as will be our guest today. But I'm Sandra Flach. Welcome to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, where it is my honor to encourage and equip you for your parenting journey. I've been an adoptive mom for over 26 years, so I get it. My husband and I have raised 5. Well, they're all now adults, but we still have 2 at home. Kids through kinship adoption and international adoptions. Our kids have all experienced trauma and prenatal exposure. 2 are diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So I know the challenges and I know the joys that, we can find along this road. So I hope that you will find this podcast an invaluable resource for your journey. And if you are watching this podcast on our YouTube channel, you will see a snowy scene behind me, which is not, a mock background. It is real. I am in the snowy winter of upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains, where I'm recording working remotely for most of the month of February. We spend a lot of time up here year round. You probably hear me talk about it a lot, but we have got a ton of snow. The snowbanks on the side of the road are like 4 feet high. It's crazy. And we're supposed to get some more snow all throughout the week. So I'm just hunkered down and love being up here. It just ministers to my soul. And my kiddo does best up here as well. So that's my explanation. So if you are just listening to this and you do want to see what it looks like, you can either check out my social media. I'm on Instagram at Sandra Flach JFO. I'm on Facebook, or you could just go to the YouTube channel at Justice for Orphans YouTube channel to see this podcast and see my snowy background, and you can see me talk to you and have this podcast interview. So anyway, as I prattle on, let's get over that and on to our guest, because today we have with us kids and student pastor, author, and speaker Kim Botto. Kim is a mom of 5 kids, 2 adopted from Ukraine. I was excited to find out. Through her speaking, writing, and coaching, Kim works with parents, church leaders, and organizations to equip volunteer and staff teams, strengthen families, and support parents. She's the author of the soon-to-be-released book, Boundless Hope for Every Child. Please welcome Kim Botto. Hey, Kim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sandra. I'm glad to be here.
I am so excited. We travel in the same circles, but we have yet to actually meet in person. So at least we're getting to connect here. I will look you up at CAFO in October in Houston, Texas. But I read your book, so I know we have some things in common, including you've adopted children from Ukraine. And I love a good adoption story, and especially when Ukraine is involved. So let's just start so our listeners could get to know you. What led you to adopt from Ukraine, and, what led you to adopt and why Ukraine, I should say?
Okay. I felt like adoption was always going to be a part of our story. I got married. My husband was all about caring for vulnerable kids, but was not about adoption. He felt like he wouldn't be able to love a kid like his own that had his DNA. Well, what happened along the way, we had 3 biological children. we got a call from somebody who was just an acquaintance that was doing a private adoption that was looking for a foster family to take in a newborn baby. And we were not a foster family. But as we continued to talk to them, we found out that you didn't need to be a foster family because it was a private adoption. And so I went to the hospital and picked up a 2-day-old baby and brought him home. And in the midst of Joey, who's now 22, staying with us, my husband, God really showed my husband that he, in fact, could love a child as his own, regardless of whether he was, part of their DNA or not. So that started us on a journey of adoption. And our two oldest kids, who were in high school at the time, had just gotten back from a mission trip to Ukraine where they visited orphanages in Ukraine. And so that just seemed they were passionate about it. They wanted to help those kids. It was a family decision, not just Mark and me. And so we started the process to adopt from Ukraine, and we adopted our youngest daughter, Anastasia, when she was 10. We met her a couple days before she turned 10. And then a couple years later, we went back and adopted her roommate, Sasha, at the age of 15. And in between, we brought a bunch of kids from Anastasia's orphanage to the US for the summer, which was,
Wow.
that's a whole, as you can imagine, a whole story itself.
Yeah. Gosh. So what years were your adoptions?
Oh gosh. Anastasia it would be 2000, 2005 and then 2008.
All right. So we were sort of in there similarly. And I went on a missions trip also to Ukraine prior to adoption, but I had already felt called to Ukraine to adopt. My husband wasn't there yet, so we have similarities there. And then we had came home and we traveled in 2000, like late November 2006 for our first adoption,
Okay.
brought home the three kids in 2000, like January 2007. I was there for 6 weeks and then found out about our youngest one. And by the time Ukraine let us go back for him, it was 2010. So we were similar time frames in there. Wow.
Yeah,
So
we
yeah,
were over there January, February of '06 because we met Anastasia in August of '05. But as you know, it's complicated over there.
yes.
And after staying there a month, we couldn't get her home. The
Wow.
court shut down. So we had to come home and then we went back.
Yeah, we were in the process of waiting. We were approved and in the process of waiting when Ukraine shut down everything to revamp it and then didn't
Yeah.
open it back up until 2006. So
Yeah.
like October of 2006. And then we
Who
found out
knows?
that
We may have been waiting in a courtroom
we
together.
might have been
No,
around. Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know though. If we had been in a courtroom together, we'd have bonded because you're just, when you see someone who's an American and speaks your
yeah.
language, you automatically grab hold of them.
You can figure it out. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. So, what was it like bringing your girls home? They were older adoptions, especially the second adoption. You had a
Mhm.
teenager, right? She was a
Right.
teenager. So,
Right.
tell us just a little bit about what the adjustment was like. What?
Well, I think as anybody who has, especially if you have bio kids, you think, and our kids were middle school and high school. So we felt like we had the parenting thing down. Our kids were doing pretty well. They're doing really well. And so the biggest learning for us when we brought Anastasia home was that a lot of the techniques, the parenting techniques that worked really well with her, I mean, with our three bio kids,
Right.
didn't work well with her. And not only did they not work well, some of those strategies were actually harmful, like timeout.
Yeah.
For a kid who's been in timeout their whole life, they don't need timeout, they need time in.
Right.
We didn't know how much her past would affect her behavior and attitudes and beliefs in the present.
Yeah.
So because of that, and then when we brought Sasha home at 15, who had an even harder childhood, we learned even more. And that's when I really started going to school on trauma-informed care and became a Karen Purvis groupie, reading everything I could get on her, watching every video she did. And that just taught us so much and gave us so much more empathy and compassion for them too. That some of their behaviors, they weren't intentionally being defiant. They were in survival mode. They'd been in survival mode for so long. And just because they were in a safe home didn't mean that then they'd switch that survival mode off.
Yeah. They didn't know they were safe.
They didn't. They
Yeah.
didn't.
And I know that was a revelation to me as I learned, because I know we are like two peas in a pod. We have to meet in person, because it was the same thing. Like we thought we could parent like, our biological kids, and then everything was going to be great. And obviously that didn't work. It imploded. And then when we brought home, and I had shared with you previously, and many of our listeners know, first we did in 99, we welcomed a little girl who was a relative, a kinship placement, adopted her eventually, made all the mistakes on her, and then brought home three of our Ukrainian kids, and then still didn't, were lulled into thinking we were good at this and we knew what we were doing. And then a few years later brought home that one little 5-year-old that changed everything, because we knew the second we met him in the orphanage, we were not equipped. And he's the one that sent us on the journey. I found Dr. Purvis's book, The Connected Child. We went from New York to Nashville one year. She was speaking at the, doing the impact when she did Empowered to Connect herself in
Yeah.
person, went
Yeah.
there, got all the TCU DVDs and, all of that. And all the training that we could, eventually became parent trainers, and, really began to learn. So I think that happens with a lot of us. So, that's how so you did the same thing pretty much, and dove in to get trauma informed.
Right, right. And I was also at the time, I was on staff at a very large church. I led kids and student ministry, as well as our initiatives around adoption and foster care. And I realized that the church wasn't equipped.
Oh yeah, you're right.
So our church, our team, the kids and student team, what was it, August of 2012, we prayed about, hey, what's God have for us this year? Because every year it's something different. And that year, though, it was more consistent than it typically was, as far as what people were hearing. And what they're hearing was, we want to be a place for all kids. So it wasn't enough for me to be trauma informed. We started training our staff team. We started training our volunteers. And then in the process of doing that, we learned, because we had a lot of kids that were disabled or neurodiverse, we learned that all that's trauma informed strategies, it's based on connection and relationship. That's what any kid who is different, that has trouble fitting in, that's what they need. So it was that was super great. And that we were able then to take in kids. Well, the not great part is kids get kicked out of church because of their behavior.
Yeah.
That's the not great part. Super sad part. And I want to stop that. But what we were able to do is we were able to take in kids that couldn't find a church home other places. And not only were they tolerated within our walls, their volunteers were waiting with open arms for them, thrilled to see them, knew about them, knew their strengths, knew their triggers. So that's what started me on. Then I wanted other churches would come to us and say, a kid that they couldn't accommodate. They say, wait a minute, he's at your church? We go, yeah. Like, oh, how's he doing? We're like, he's doing great. He has a one-on-one buddy. And so then churches started asking us, can you help us be a place where every kid can come and belong and thrive?
Wow. I love that. And we're going to dive into that, because just for our listeners to know, you are a TBRI practitioner.
Yep.
Correct? A trauma-free world trainer, a certified trauma and resilience trainer. You've got all that training, you've got all that experience, you're on church staff. So I love the fact that you're passionate about equipping communities to better care for kids. And that's what your book is about. So I want to talk about your book.
Okay.
I love it. So the title of the book is Boundless Hope for Every Child, Help for the Hurting, Compassion for the Misunderstood, Belonging for the Lonely. I got to read an advance copy because it's due to release the beginning of March, correct?
Correct. March 4th. Yes.
March 4th, right around the corner. And this book is for anybody working with kids, whether you're a parent, you're on church staff. I was thinking schools, Christian schools, youth groups, Sunday schools, children's ministry, all of that.
Yes.
So you were doing this work. You had your church equipped. Other churches were coming to you. So is that what led you to write the book?
Yeah. I would go to conferences and people would say, where can I get this in writing? And I think the difference with this is it's not just about kids from trauma, or it's not just about disability ministry. It's really about any kid that is having a behavior that is concerning or difficult. And a concerning behavior doesn't have to be a big behavior. It could be that a kid just sits back in the room and doesn't participate, which we don't want. We want, we want to help them participate. So that's what started me on it. And I actually retired from church staff and I went to work I felt like God was calling me to be even closer proximity to the hurting. So I worked for a nonprofit in Cincinnati where I was the training and development director. And we worked with multi-system involved youth. So these were all kids that were under the care of Job and Family Services, which is like Child Protective Services, and we're also involved in other systems. And it just broke my heart. It continued to break my heart that these kids would, because of some of their behaviors, people very quickly jump to judgment. And when we think a kid is too far gone, we've lost hope for a kid. When we think a kid is, and I would never say this, so I'm doing air quotes, but listeners, bad, if we, that is going to change the way that we interact and engage with a kid. And a kid's also going to pick up on that. So the whole thing about the book is to have boundless hope.
Yeah.
Because the Bible says with God, all things are possible. We might not be able to do it on our own, but with God, all things are possible. So I want to look into the eyes of a kid who's lost hope. They lose hope in themselves. They lose hope in the world around them. And through our, understanding that they're a child of God. They're wonderfully and fearfully made. We can then help reframe what they believe about themselves, which will then change their behavior. They've been taught that they're bad and they're not going to amount to anything. So the book is all about first just looking at our mindset. What do we believe about kids? And then given some science and research to build empathy. Because if we understand, like Sandra, you were talking about with fetal alcohol syndrome, once you understand how it impacts their brain and their behavior, you naturally have more empathy for them. And so you're going to be more likely wanting to help them. You are going to be more compassionate. So we do that. We want to build up empathy and then just a whole bunch of practical strategies.
Yeah, and I love that. You're right, a whole bunch. So let's unpack the book a little bit.
Okay.
I have a quote. I love your quote here. A child's behavior or response is often more about what happened in their past than what's happening in the moment. You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah. I think we forget, like, let's use the example of a church. When a kid comes into our room, their story started long before they stepped foot in our room.
Yeah.
And it might be a really big thing that happened. It might just be that they got yelled at in the car on the way to church, which will make them behave in a different way. So understanding that, I would hope, would increase our compassion. And Sandra, I think you probably have had the same experiences with people where you think, oh my gosh, what the heck is wrong with that person? But then as we get to know them, we understand that they have been hurt in their past. And maybe there's something that I'm doing that is reminding them of a rejection they had in the past. And so for kids, just understand it's really that quote. Once we understand that, then we're not going to take things so personally because their behavior is not a direct reflection of us. They didn't wake up saying, oh, I'm going to go to church and ruin Kim's day.
Right.
They're just communicating the only way they know how, and that's through their behavior, and their past affects it. And research, that's not just me saying this, and I know you've read all the research. Research shows that their past is going to impact how they behave in the present.
Yeah. Yeah. You also use the word curious a lot, right? Getting curious about these behaviors, what's going on. So what do you explain that a little bit for our listeners? What do you mean by get curious?
Well, if we're curious, that automatically closes the door to judgment.
Right.
When we make an assumption, because some people might be turned off by the word judgment, it feels kind of harsh, but we can make an assumption about a kid. Once we make that assumption, then we've turned off our curious button. Whereas if we're curious and start thinking, I wonder what's going on with that child, or wow, he has these same big behaviors every week during the same portion of the kids or youth ministry. Maybe the beginning, the free time makes him really anxious because he doesn't know what to do and he feels alone, doesn't feel he's a part of the crowd. So I think, yeah, just being curious and seeking to dig underneath the behavior. Well, and Karen Purvis, who we both love, the quote that really changed the way I think is behavior is the language of children who have lost their voice.
Yeah.
So they're talking to us. They're just not using their words. They're using their behavior. So when we're curious, we are going to start asking ourselves questions like, when is this behavior happening? What might be the underlying cause? Try some things. I always love snack and a drink. That's always a great thing to try, because not only might that meet a physical need they have, it's also a great relationship builder. I mean, that's why so many people meet up at coffee shops and have a cup of coffee and chat.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. And we know that kids in adoptive placements, foster placements they've all experienced some level of trauma. But, like you said, this is not just limited to kids who have been in foster care or who've been adopted. And, churches and schools are filled with kids who have experienced trauma, but also who are neurodivergent, have some kind of invisible disability. And I love how you address that in the book, because I know, in what I do with FASD, that is certainly an invisible disability. But give us a list of some of the other invisible disabilities that people might not even really recognize right away.
Okay. Well, first, let's just broadly define invisible disability. Something like Down syndrome, muscular dystrophy. When you see that child, it's pretty apparent that there is a disability. With things like autism, which is 1 in 36 kids,
Mhm.
or ADHD, which the most recent is 11% of the kids are diagnosed with ADHD. Those kids, it's not as easy to determine that they have a difference. So what happens is in anxiety, and some people will put anxiety and depression in that also, but there's a whole list of things that could be invisible disabilities. But autism and ADHD are something that a lot of people are
Yeah.
engaging kids that have this right now. So what happens is we assume that their behavior is something that they can control, and so then we don't go to help them. Whereas if we just assume there's something else going on, we are going to be much more likely to approach with compassion and curiosity and try to help them. Maybe they need noise canceling headphones. Maybe they need a little one-on-one attention in the hall. Maybe they need their little favorite toy with them. So yeah, I think invisible disabilities, that's why we have to be curious,
Yeah.
because they're invisible. So we don't
Because
know. So let's
yeah.
just assume that there's something going on with the child. And I love Dr. Ross Green's quote. He said, children do well when they can.
Hmm. Yeah.
So let's just assume they're doing the best they can. And if they're not meeting our expectations, well, then they need help. And we may need to change our environment, break up the task.
Adjust our expectations.
Just for
Yeah.
sure. For sure.
Yeah. And that's, like I said, FASD is also considered an invisible disability, and it's actually higher than autism. It's 1 in 20 school age kids here in the United States. Of course, there's a vast number, the percentage is
Wow.
higher among the population of kids in adoptive and foster placements, but 1 in 20 is your average school age kiddo, in the United States. So at least one in every classroom. And it's not just, kids born to alcoholic moms, but most women don't know they're pregnant, until they're several weeks into their pregnancy. And unless you're intentionally planning a pregnancy and avoiding alcohol, you could be just drinking socially on the weekends, having a glass of wine, find out you're, 8, 10 weeks pregnant, and then, there's no safe amount of alcohol or time in a pregnancy. So we see, the numbers there are quite high. And so many of these kids get that ADHD diagnosis. A lot of them also
Right.
have an autism diagnosis. It's tricky, but, did you want to say anything on that before I get to my
I
next
didn't
point?
know. I didn't know it's that high. I didn't know it was 1 in
Yeah,
20. That's good to
yeah.
know. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think it was Dr. Ira Chasnoff did a study. And I think it was something like, I don't know if it was 86%, but in the 80s, 80% of kids in foster care, or out of home placement have been prenatally exposed, but not diagnosed,
Yeah.
accurately. So
Yeah.
it is definitely prevalent, but either way, whatever's causing the invisible disability, we have kids whose brains just work differently. So
Right.
not passing those judgments, but being curious and wondering, gosh, this kiddo has a hard time when everything is loud and crazy, right? They do better
Right.
when it's quiet, right? Trying to, have that, be curious and think about those things because we want all of our families and all of our kids to be able to be in church. And I think you said 1 in 3, this was in your book, you might have said it a little bit earlier, but 1 in 3 special needs families have either been asked to leave a church or chose to leave a church because they did not feel welcome. So, what can we do? What can churches do to change that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's research by Eric Carter. He's brilliant. He's done so a lot of people are surprised that it's that low.
Yeah.
Um, but so some statistics say higher, but I really trust his numbers. So what can we do?
Yeah.
It's when a kid shows up and isn't meeting our expectations, let's figure out what we can do to better help that child thrive and really do well in our environment. Are there things that we can change? Are we, talk to the parents, partner with the parents? And one thing that's hard is, especially in the church, a lot of times on the weekends, we're busy and we're talking to all these people. And so what we end up unintentionally doing is the information we give to the parent is what's going wrong with the child.
Right.
That's not helpful. We had a expectation with our volunteers that you always, always, always start with the good news.
Mm.
You always talk about what you enjoyed about the child, what you noticed that they really loved. You reinforce that you loved having the child in there. And then you just give the parents the facts. We don't diagnose. We don't say things like they were out of control because what does that mean? Now we could say they were unable to sit in their chair during small group or during large group. They ran around the room. Those are facts. And
Hmm.
then partner with the parent. But the important thing is to continually remind the parent that we want your child there. We want to work with you. We want this to be a safe place for your kid. We want your kid to have fun here. We want them to be able to hear about Jesus in a language they can understand. So approaching the parent with curiosity and empathy and continually reminding them we want their kid there. Because a kid who exhibits hard behaviors in church, they're exhibiting those hard behaviors everywhere,
Hmm.
typically 99.9% of the time. And I've had parents where when I seek to talk to them so often before I even open my mouth to say anything, their head will drop.
Hmm.
You can tell that they feel ashamed,
Yeah.
and we don't want to do that. We want to be the one that's encouraging them and reminding them that we are here to support you and you're an amazing parent.
Yeah, and like I've heard like I probably all of our listeners because most of them are adoptive and foster parents, they get, we've all been in churches where, we're the ones getting called out to get our kid. Our kid is the one
Right.
always in trouble. Other parents don't want our kids around. That, the teachers are dreading our kiddo coming to class. And I've had a dear sweet mama of, 2 little boys, and I'm not in children's ministry, but she's an adopted mom, and I just went to chat with her before the service, and was talking with her, and she just had these tears in her eyes because she was like, because they hadn't been in church in a while, and I went over
Yeah.
to talk to her, and she said, I need to be here, but I always we always end up I always get called out of the service, and then we end up going home, you know
Right.
and this poor mom, it needs to be in church, she needs fellowship, she needs the word, but yet, you know and not bashing that this church has gone on to get training, right? So a lot of times it's even staff, we don't know what we don't know, so we need to make sure that they're learning and they're being better equipped to be able to support these kiddos. So when a church is open to that, That's wonderful. And that's why I love your book, because you're going to be, equipping churches to be able to, work with these children so the kiddos can be successful, but also so the parents can be more successful.
Yes. And I want to go back to the parents, but I want to say also, when we do that, we're training the other children in the room.
Yeah.
Because when we send a kid away, what we are telling all the other children in the room is that when a kid has a big behavior or when a kid is different, we don't engage with them. And
Mm.
that is not the message we want to send. Instead, what we want to send, the message to their peers is we're a safe place for everybody. And
Yeah.
we are going to work to determine what each individual kid needs. One kid might need to have a squishy ball that he holds the whole time. Another kid might need to stand in the back of a large group rather than sit on the floor. And so I want to just point out, we're by the way that we are interacting with these kids, we are training the other kids in the room. So,
Yeah.
think about that. Is what we're doing what we want to train them on? And as far as parents, the one thing that's really surprised me about this book is I really wanted to be for churches and organizations and schools. That was my primary audience
Yeah.
because I didn't want parents to read this and think, oh my gosh, another thing I have to do. I can't be curious all the time. Sometimes I just need to go in my room and hide under my blanket, with a mindless magazine. But what I found is so many parents are reading it and messaging me and saying, like, can you help me talk to my pastor? Because I don't
Yeah.
think he understands. Or they'll say, oh my gosh, I feel so heard and known. I'm
Yeah.
not, I'm not a bad parent. It's just that my kid has hard stuff. And so it has been encouraging and it has been heartbreaking to me
Yeah.
because so many of them feel like their church does not understand them. And what's even more hurtful is they don't believe that there is a desire among the church
Yeah.
leaders to understand them.
Yeah. And that has to change. And I think, even
Yeah, it
as
does.
parents, when we didn't know what we didn't know, we had to go after it and learn it, but we were invested because they're our kids. But the church has to come to that place where they need to recognize that there's something that they need to learn, to be able to better support their kids, right? So Kim, go ahead, you were going to say something?
Well, and I'll say, I I will sometimes say I think the church leaders they're ignorant. They don't know because they haven't been in close proximity.
Right.
So I believe that my role and a lot of other people that are out there advocating, and like you, Sandra, our role is to raise awareness in church leaders
Yeah.
of the families. It's not just the kid, it's the whole family that's hurting
Right.
because when we don't joyfully welcome kids, which is actually the opposite of what Jesus did, because Jesus,
Right.
he said, let the little children come to me. And he didn't say just the clean, compliant ones.
Yeah.
Um, so what I think we need to do is, and I think there's an army really rising up. There seems to be a lot more interest in this,
Yeah.
helping church leaders understand that families are hurting, that they want to be in church. They desperately want to be in church. And in order for us to welcome them into our church, it's really not that hard. It's somebody read the book and they said, so basically what you're saying is just be a decent human being to people. And a lot of it is.
Yeah.
It's just being kind. And if a kid isn't doing well in one environment, well then we as the adults, it's our responsibility to change the environment. I was just talking to a school principal and he said, when a kid doesn't feel like they belong, he goes, it's us. It's the principal, the educators, the school staff. It's our responsibility to make changes so that kid belongs.
Yeah.
And I think too often it feels overwhelming and it's not, I know that it can feel overwhelming, but I think with the right mindset, with some of the right information as far as what these kids have experienced and how it affects their behavior, we can have a whole bunch of churches where these kids can come in and thrive. And their little peers, their friends, their high school friends, they're going to realize, oh, this is a great kid. They just process things differently. They
Mhm.
might have a shorter fuse because of their past. I had a kid at student camp who roomed in a cabin with a foster kid. And I mean, that was forced proximity.
Yeah.
I don't know that he would have chosen to be with this kid. At the end of the week, he came to me in tears and said, I had no idea what it was like to be a foster kid. I had no idea the loss that he'd experienced. And I have a foster kid in my high school that I've always thought is just a jerk and
Mhm.
obnoxious, and I avoided him. And I'm going to make an effort to make friends with that kid next year. So, churches, we can plant these seeds.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of it is, I'm thinking of that mindset because it's with the invisible disability. I've worked with a mom whose teenage son wasn't doing well in school, adopted, trauma history, possible prenatal exposure, but was labeled by, teachers as lazy,
Right.
doesn't care, doesn't try. He's
Right.
just a kid who doesn't, he would rather just leave the classroom every day and go to the bathroom and vape kind of thing.
Right.
But yet, this kid ultimately, he does have a trauma history. He did get a diagnosis of, I think it was ARND, alcohol related neurodevelopmental disorder. So he's on the FASD spectrum. But the school failed him completely because they just labeled him as a problem kid who just didn't want to do good and didn't bother to try, and he was just lazy. Um, and ended up, mom ended up pulling him out of school to homeschool him because the school just, they had written him off, right? There's those passing those judgments, looking at the behavior and passing that judgment and not being curious as to why. Why did this kid leave the classroom, want to leave the classroom every day at a certain time? To go
Right.
to, why was he going to the bathroom every day? Like, it wasn't just that he was vaping. This could be a kiddo who, something was going on and that was his coping mechanism. What's going on? So it's
Right.
being curious, changing our mindsets, and not just passing that judgment on looking at the behavior and writing a kid off.
Right. And having hope for the
Yeah.
kid. I mean,
Yeah.
this kid's story is still being written.
Yeah.
What I have found is as I walk along kids who have really hard stories, God changes my story too.
Yeah.
I mean, not he continues to write my story and I grow in ways that I didn't even think I needed to grow in.
Yeah, I love that. So, and you offer a lot of nuts and bolts practical stuff. So just let's look at a few of those things. So,
Okay.
how can church staff create spaces where all kids feel welcomed and can find places that, they feel they belong, they feel that they're known, um, you know, for any kid, but also, of course, our kids with, trauma or invisible disability.
Yeah, I think I mean one thing I always say is use their name. Sandra, use their name.
Yeah.
People love to hear their name. And in churches, so often they have tags on them. So that makes it super easy. Find out what they're interested in.
Mhm.
If we have a kid in our room that maybe pushes our buttons and really kind of annoys us, which that's going to happen sometimes,
Mhm.
let's spend time getting to know them. And the educators use what they say, 2 and 10, and it's for 10 days in a row. You spend 2 minutes of direct one-on-one conversation with that child who maybe is frustrating you or is having challenging behaviors. And they said just 2 minutes a day over 10 days makes a huge difference in the kid's behavior because so
Mhm.
often the behavior they're seeking attention. Because sometimes people will say, well, I know they're just attention seeking. I go, right. So
Give
give
it to
it to
them.
them. That's right. Give
Yes.
it to them. You're right. Like ding, ding, ding. You're right. And give it to them before they need it. So as soon as they come in the door, just spend a couple minutes looking in their eyes and asking them about their week. And if they tell you something, like they're going to have a big test this week, or they're trying out for the soccer team, make a note on use the notes app on your phone, make a note, and the next week review it before the kid comes in. And do you know how they will light up if you remembered and asked them about how soccer tryouts or math was? So
Yeah.
it's about what Jesus did. It's about building relationship and getting to know people. And then, Sandra, as we get to know them, figuring out maybe how we need to adjust. Like the example I gave, don't force everybody to sit on the floor in large group. Like if there's a kid that doesn't do well there, like let them sit in the chair in the back.
Mhm. Yeah.
Be flexible
Yeah.
and tell the parents how much you love having their kid there
Mm.
because you might be the only one that is telling them. I told a mom once it started because her child had a behavior that we needed to talk to her about, but I started out by telling her how much I enjoyed him and some of the things we talked about, and she just started bawling. She said,
Mm.
nobody has ever told, this kid was 4.5, nobody has ever told me that they've enjoyed having my kid around.
Aw.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And we can be the difference. We can tell them what we see, the potential we see.
Yeah. That's ministry.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, yeah. You devote, Kim, a whole chapter in the book to what not to do, which
Yeah.
includes, shaming, addressing the shame. I think it was shame, sin, and profanity, right? Those are the things that, those are the things we have to watch out for, that we be careful that we're not doing. We don't want to shame a kid, point out their sin, correct that, profanity all of the time. I've struggled with this, right? I have a teen who's a swearer. Uh,
Mhm.
so what about in churches or even families? We get this wrong.
Right. You know, um, on the shame piece,
Yeah.
shaming, Brene Brown has written a whole
Oh
bunch on
yeah.
shaming.
Yeah.
Shaming does not improve behavior. And
No.
if we just think about when somebody's made us feel bad about ourselves, that doesn't then make us want to work harder to do better. So rather than think about the words we're saying,
Hmm.
and also we don't want to feel shame about it. I always say, don't be ashamed, be convicted. Be convicted and do it a different way. Um, and also, if we say something to our kids, later we realize, oh my gosh, those words did not build my child up. Those words just cut him down. Go back and apologize.
Mm.
Teach a kid what it looks like to say, hey, I messed up. I should not have said that to you. And that does not mean that we don't have boundaries and we don't have expectations and we still have consequences, but we don't need to shame a kid
Yeah.
in order to help them change their behavior because shame actually not going to work. I mean, as far as profanity, I've been in so many situations in um, working with people from the church, whether it be in a group home or in the church setting. And as soon as a kid, and this happens with the little kids too, but especially with the older kids, as soon as they drop some profanity, then immediately the conversation turns to the language.
Hmm. Right.
Instead, let's really listen to what they're saying and try to not be so distracted by the profanity because so often their profanity is just a way for them to express the deep anger or
Right.
hurt that they have. We definitely want to work with them on other ways to express it, without
Yeah.
dropping bombs. But if we immediately stop the conversation, we're going to miss out on what the kid has to say. And I have found more once we start listening to them, then they have less of a need
Hmm.
to use such coarse language.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
part of using the coarse language is to get our attention.
Yeah. But if we just focus on, if we launch into a lecture about how we don't talk like that here,
Right.
right? Then you've lost that connection with the kiddo and you're not being curious as to why, what's going on, right?
Right.
What's really going on.
And if they're dysregulated as they're using the profanity, I mean, Sandra, as you know, there's no point in talking to a kid who's dysregulated because they cannot hear you. They've lost access to that thinking part of their brain. So help them calm, get to the root of what they're really saying. And then at another point, talk to them about different ways. I was actually talking to a mom who was super excited that her kid had cussed, I can't remember exactly, it was like cussed out a sibling because what the kid used to do was punch the sibling out or punch a hole in the wall. So she
Mhm.
said, this is growth.
You're
We're making progress. We're still
making progress.
working on alternatives, but
Yeah.
we're making a move in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely. And then the other part of that was the sin where, and I would see this in church staff, and I've seen it actually with some parents where they kind of get fixated on, well, this child's behavior is because they're sinning. It's sin.
Mhm.
So we need to like fix that. Tell us about that.
Well, look at how Jesus, even if they were sinning, and it's difficult to determine, is this willful disobedience, or is this them communicating the only the way they know how? And I love to use the example of Zacchaeus, where, okay, everybody knows he was willfully disobedient. I mean, he was stealing from people. But Jesus's first words to him were not, "You thief, pay everybody back."
Mm,
His first words were, "Hey, come on down from the tree, Zacchaeus, and let's go hang out at your house." So I think that's a great model for us to really spend time building relationship with a kid, talking to them. As Jesus, they went and had a meal, sit down, have a meal, take them out for pizza. One of our adopted daughters, we ended up going to Starbucks a lot and just talking over a croissant and her favorite frappuccino. It was building that relationship. And then
mm,
in that, we want them to understand where there is sin in their life, but we can't always assume that it's willful disobedience. And I actually like to assume at first that it's not, that they're trying to communicate to us.
yeah. And what you were saying made me even think of the scripture, and I'm not sure exactly where it is in the New Testament, but it is, the goodness of God leads men unto repentance, right?
Yes.
So it
Yes.
is.
God's kindness. Yes.
Yes, the kindness of God. So,
Yes.
that is demonstrated, right? Not jumping to the sin part, but jumping to building that relationship with them and being kind and curious and connecting with them goes an
Right.
awfully long way for sure.
Right.
One other thing I wanted to ask about, because you address it, and anybody who's familiar with TBRI and all of that is very familiar with felt safety, right?
Yes.
So, what is, for our listeners, what is felt safety, and how can, churches especially build that felt safety?
Okay. Well, for churches, we work really, really hard to make our environment safe. So we know that a kid is safe, but that is not enough. A
Right.
kid needs to feel safe. So what felt safety means is a child actually within their body feels safe in our environment. And
Mm,
there are some really easy things that we can try and do to increase their felt safety. Things like predictable transitions. A kid who's been through trauma has had a lot of transitions in their life, and often what's on the other side of the transition isn't a good thing. So even something as simple as moving from small group to large group might make them anxious. So
mm,
give kids a heads up, and not a yelling from the room, "We're going to large group in 5 minutes." But in a calm way, we can go to the different, the different kids or different kid groups and just tell them, "We're going to go to large group in 5 minutes." Visual schedules can
mhm,
really help. Visual schedules are used a lot with kids who are autistic or neurodiverse, but also our kids from trauma, for them to be able to just look and easily identify, okay, here's where I am right now, and these are the things that are coming next. That
mm.
relaxes them and will
Yeah.
help them feel safe. Having this, I always say, if you've got a kid who's experienced trauma, if a kid is adopted or foster care, like you said, they've all experienced some level of loss and grief, and it can come
Mhm,
up in a whole bunch of different ways in a whole bunch of different
mm,
years. But make sure that they have a safe person in your building, so that if they do, you notice that they start maybe feeling anxious or dysregulated, that this safe person can be brought in.
mhm,
Another thing is work with the students. We would work out hand signals where they would let us know, just like a timeout signal. And that's your sign that I am starting to feel like things aren't going in a good place right now. And so that's your sign then to just pull them aside and talk about what they need. That's how we increase felt safety. Those are just some of the ways. There's a bunch of
yeah.
ways.
Yeah. And I love that, because we might know as the adults that they're safe, but if they don't feel that way, they're not going to be able to focus and learn what we're wanting to teach them anyway. They need to
Right.
know that they're safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because what we want to do, whether it be in our family, if we're talking about a difficult subject, or at school, we want them to be able to hear what we're saying.
Mhm.
Yeah. And if they don't feel safe, all their energy is going to be looking on, scouting out what's going on outside the house, what's going on in the halls
Yeah.
outside of the room. What's that noise? They're hypersensitive to sounds. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons. It's not just nice to have. It's
Yeah.
they have to have it in order to learn and grow.
Yeah, they have to have it. And I mean, I got a visual of this with our son. I think he'd been home from Ukraine 10 years. We had COVID. And when the kids went back to school in September of 2020, our school was having in-person classes, at least for the special needs, class that he was in. Um, he was not, the teacher 3 weeks into school said he's not learning anything. He doesn't even remember his like consonants and vowels. And I'm like, you know, well, I know he knows them because we had homeschooled at one point. I taught those
Right.
to him. But what I recognized was because we ended up having to pull him out. It was disastrous to avoid a mental health crisis. But what it was for him was the fear of the unknown. And, we kept him sheltered from a lot of the news, but at the same time, he picked up on because the whole world was shut down.
Sure.
His fear was if my parents get COVID and die, then I'm without parents. So he was hyper vigilant. He was back in that survival because he feared that he could lose his parents again. And in that state, he wasn't feeling safe and he couldn't learn because his whole brain was focused on this terrible thing that was going on around him. So it is real. The child has to feel safe in order to learn.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Sandra Flach, host of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, and FASD educator Debbie Raymond invite you to join Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, diagnosed or not. This faith-based support community meets online 3 times each month, features special VIP guests, and a private Facebook group for members only, which includes Soul Care Saturday video devotionals led by Sandra and Deb. Both Sandra and Deb are adoptive moms raising kids with FASD and facilitators of the Facets neurobehavioral model. For details and to register, visit justicefororphansny.org/hope-community. That's justicefororphansny.org/hope-community.
So healing, as we know, Kim, takes place in safe relationships. How can church staff, teachers, leaders, how can they build a foundation of connection with kids, especially kids with, neurodiversity?
I mean, take the time to get to know them, to get to know their strengths, to get to know their interests. I mean, I have failed at this with my own children. I was actually just reminded the other day, there's something that my daughter is super interested in. And somebody asked me, it's anime, and they said, well, what's her favorite character? And I went, I don't have any idea. And they're like, what's her favorite series? I'm like, I don't have any idea. Which, if there's somebody in your life that's really interested in something, even if it's not interesting to you,
Mhm.
my daughter is super interesting to me. And I want to build a relationship with her. So I came home from that lunch and texted her. And well, actually, no, she came over for dinner that night. And I asked her all these questions about it. And she's like, Mom, you've never asked me questions about this before. And I said, I know. And I don't know why, because I know how much you love it. So we talked about I didn't even know why she loved it. Like, who introduced her to it? It was actually my son-in-law. And so as far as churches, be interested in the things they're interested in. If kids, and for little bitty ones, especially kids who've experienced trauma, if there's something that they really love that wouldn't cost a lot of money, like maybe they like blue trains, well, buy a blue train and have it in the room for them to show them that you're listening to what they're interested in, and it could help with separation from their parent. But really, it's all about just building relationships, because when someone feels safe and secure with somebody, and that comes through relationship, they are going to be in a much better place to hear what we have to say, whether it be in school or church, at home.
Yeah. And not just the popular, easy, fun kids to be around, but the kids who
Yeah.
really struggle with those big behaviors, because those are the ones that, really we're talking about with, they've got the struggles, they may have the trauma, the invisible disability, and they need that connection.
Right.
Um, you know.
Well, it's funny you say that because I was talking to a youth minister who was really having a hard, it's a female, really having a hard time with a group of boys. And they were disruptive and she felt disrespectful. And I said, well, give me a flow of your day. Like, how does it work? Well, as the students would come in, she hung out with all the compliant
Mhm.
females,
Yeah.
the students. And I said, well, do you talk to the guys? No, I said, well, okay, here's my challenge to you. Give a wave to the compliant, easy ones as they come in, but go and spend time playing video games or ping pong or whatever this other group is doing. And she started doing it. And guess what happened? Their behavior improved.
Yeah.
They built up respect for her because actually what we're communicating to them is we don't respect you.
Right. Yeah. So good. You talked, Kim, about the importance of addressing the problem or the behavior, not about just fixing the kid, right? We always want to, the temptation is there to like, let's fix this kid, fix this problem. Um, we need to look at the need behind the behavior. We mentioned
Right.
that a little bit. So, what might be some of those needs when we're seeing these bigger behaviors? What would church staff, what might they need to be aware of? What could be going on?
Well, especially like a kid in foster care, they could be afraid. They could be extremely anxious about the future, where they're going to be next. We can't, we can't promise them anything about their future, but what we can do is just spend time, um, talking with them, getting them to share. Dan Siegel talks about name it to tame it. So if
Mhm.
they're able to feel safe enough with us to share the hard parts of their stories, that will help ease some of their stress over it. Also, if you see, so I went to that one first, and that some aren't that easy. It's not just going to be a cracker or noise canceling headphones that are going to help,
Right.
but the relationship will help. But also, if you see a kid that's having really big behaviors, it might be due to the noises in the room. It
Yeah.
might be due to maybe they're in too close proximity to people. Maybe they need more personal space. It might be somebody who, um, if we're doing an activity that they can't do, because we make a lot of assumptions on what kids are
Mhm.
capable of doing. And
Yeah.
I always say assume competence, but maybe their fine motor skills aren't so great. So the
Yeah.
activity we're doing in small group, they can't do. Well, rather than have to, what they think would be embarrassing to admit they can't do it, they might just rip up the activity.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen there was a mom that shared her kid was dyslexic and had a major meltdown every time before he went to small group, to the point that, and I think he was in middle school, they would have to call her out. Well, they finally realized it's because in his small group leader required that everybody read parts of the Bible
Yes.
story.
Yep.
And and I don't even know that he knew that's why he was having such a meltdown. But this was not a kid who had meltdowns, but he was so nervous
Yeah.
and so anxious about it that he communicated through his words or through his behavior, not his
Yeah.
words.
And that makes so much sense because I know even like my two younger boys never really fit in good with their peer group. And that's how usually children's ministry is set up, right? You're in with
Mhm.
your peer group by age. But with their invisible disability, their academic level was much younger. Like right now, I have a 19-year-old who reads at a third grade level. Right. But if you put him in the youth group with back when he was in there, 17, 18, 16, 15, he couldn't read at the same level. So sitting in the circle and going around or reading the Bible, he couldn't do those things. So he would avoid going, he would, be a little bit disruptive, things like that, when really he was having a hard time because he didn't fit in there. Same thing with sensory. I know sometimes our churches, like the way our church is set up, the entryway, the foyer or whatever people call it, the cafe area, the acoustics are terrible. So after church, when everybody's congregating there and the
Right.
kids are running around and parents are talking, it is so loud. My son makes a beeline as soon as the service is over and he goes right out and sits in the car. I've somebody has said to me, "Oh, he's not very social or he's antisocial." I'm like, "No, he's actually anti, loud
Loud noise.
noise." But he's very social one-on-one in a quiet setting, but it is the loud. He can't handle that loud noise. So, be like going back to what you talk about in the book about being curious, why are we seeing the behaviors we're seeing? It's not necessarily willful disobedience or something negative. We've got kids who aren't giving us a hard time, they're having a hard time.
Right.
And
Right.
understanding that is so important.
Right. And you talking about your child that wasn't on the same academic level, he doesn't want to be down there with third graders. That
Right.
would be super weird for him. But instead, as leaders, one thing a trauma-informed principle is you don't tell people that, okay, everybody's going to read. You
Right.
ask whoever is comfortable read. Or what I even like to do, if there's going to be certain things that people need to do like that, I will ask the kid before we go into group, hey, I need this read today. Would you be comfortable doing that? Or I need somebody to share, blank. Would you be comfortable doing that? So you're not asking them in a group where they're
Right.
going to feel uncomfortable. And back to your son, going back and kind of reframing expectations as far as,
Mhm.
hey, everybody, this is the way we've always done it in the past. We're not going to do that anymore. Nobody has to read unless they want to. And actually,
Right.
I'm just going to ask for one or two volunteers each time. That then would make your son feel more comfortable because
Right.
until that is stated, that's no longer an expectation, he's still going to be nervous about it.
Right. Exactly. And then we could see those behaviors, right?
Right.
They're going to start acting, being little bit dysregulated probably. So let's see. Gosh, there's so many things. I have all these notes from when I was reading your book. Um, let's see. So we kind of talked about creating environments to help kids thrive. Anything else that you want to talk about? I know we talked about, predictable transitions, visual schedule. Anything else there that you want to talk about that, really churches should be able to implement and do?
I mean, I think all of those are great starting points. I think we can get overwhelmed with all the different ideas. So I think pick one of those and just
Right.
try it.
Yeah, definitely. So the book Boundless Hope is packed with excellent content, and we can't rewrite the whole book right here or read the whole book right here, Kim. But is there anything from the book that we haven't talked about yet, that you want to make sure that we talk about?
I think the churches can be the ones who are leading the way on providing welcoming and safe places for everybody to
Yeah,
find their people, to find their place, to be cared for others. And you don't need a PhD to do it.
that's right. Yeah, love that. Love that. So the book again is Boundless Hope for Every Child, Help for the Hurting, Compassion for the Misunderstood, Belonging for the Lonely. It releases the very beginning of March, just a couple weeks away. Kim, where can our listeners get a copy?
You can go to kimbotto.com. And that gives all the different ways you can buy it. You can buy it on Amazon. I have a store also where they can get bulk discounts or multi-copy discounts. And it's
Yeah.
BOTTO, kimbotto.com.
And we'll, of course, put a link in the show notes so our listeners can find you. But I love the idea of the discount for multiple copies because, parents could actually get some copies and hand them out to their church.
Right, 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 right.
Yeah, I love that. And so you have a website, kimbotto.com. Anything else that they can find there aside from the book? Do you have a blog? What else do you
I have
do?
a blog. I have all kinds of information on not just church ministry, not just ministry, but also parenting, student ministry. Yeah, I do several virtual meetings with ministry leaders, especially around kids who may have challenging behavior. So yeah, all that stuff's on there.
Oh, wonderful. So we'll make sure, again, that's kimbotto.com. It will be in the show notes so that our listeners can quickly scroll down and find that. But Kim, as we wrap up, as I mentioned, most of our listeners are adoptive parents, foster parents. Would you leave us with some words of encouragement?
Well, I would say to the parents, Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Mm.
I know that it's hard and people don't understand, but continue advocating for your kid, continue raising awareness because you're doing that not just for your own kid, you're doing that for other kids and other kids' families. And I really believe that churches want to be a place for your kid to succeed and thrive and for you to feel supported. And we just need to continue to work to raise awareness.
Yeah. Equipping the church.
Yep.
Yeah. Kim, thank you so much for all you are
Thank
doing
you.
to equip the church through
Thank
your
you.
your trainings and your speakings, and of course, this amazing book. And I pray that it will be a huge success because it's definitely something I believe should be, used by all church ministry for every church. So we hope to
Thank
see
you,
that
Sandra.
that movement. So thank you so much for being with us today, Kim.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening to the adoption and foster care journey today. I hope you were inspired and encouraged by my conversation with Kim Botto. Um, Her book, Boundless Hope, excellent, excellent resource. We want this book in the hands of all of the folks who are working with our kids at our churches, at our schools, homeschool co-ops, wherever your kids are. This is definitely a resource that will be beneficial for our kids and for all kids, really. So make sure that you grab a copy, whether you go to Amazon, you go to kimbotto.com, make sure you get yourself a copy. I highly, highly recommend. In addition to encouraging you through this podcast, I also want to, of course, equip you for your parenting journey. We became trauma informed, my husband and I. We talked a lot about that today in this podcast. But when our boys had fetal alcohol syndrome, that there wasn't a whole lot out there for that. And now they're young adults. And I want to make sure that you have the resources for your parenting journey that we didn't have in the early days of our parenting. And you may not know if your kid was prenatally exposed to alcohol. Maybe they were exposed to drugs, but you don't know about alcohol, or maybe you don't know about any of it. And maybe they weren't, and they just have trauma. However, a lot of what I teach with the neurobehavioral model is for every kiddo, whether it's trauma, whether the behaviors are from prenatal exposure or, another invisible disability. The neurobehavioral model that I use when I teach all of my training for FASD works straight across the board. So whether your kiddo has it or not, you would benefit from this training. And every month I offer a free intro to FASD online workshop. I also have, longer sessions where it's 3 hours. I unpack, like I said, the neurobehavioral model, just understanding the brain works differently, what happens when it works differently, and how we can better support our kids so that they can be successful, right? Being curious about those behaviors, like we talked about with Kim today, what is going on, why is it going on, and how can we better support and accommodate? So, so important. So I've got lots of those trainings available online. And also coming up this spring, starting May 1st, I'm offering a 6-week deep dive using the facets neurobehavioral approach. It is 6 3-hour sessions once a week for 6 weeks, starting May 1st. It's online. You will want to hop on this training, and it's for anybody parenting kids with brain differences, including FASD. So check that out. You would go to justicefororphansny.org, and at the top of the page, you'll see the tab that says training. And then if you click there, you'll see all of the upcoming workshops that you can register for. The intro to FASD is free. I offer that at different time every month, but you still have to register for it to get the Zoom link. They are not recorded. All of these sessions are live. I teach them. You'll be able to interact with me, lots of Q&A. You can also sign up for parent coaching. All of that is there. You heard about in the little commercial that we do, you heard about the support group for parents and caregivers of kids with FASD, diagnosed or not. You can sign up there on the website as well. And check out my personal website, sandraflach.com, where I also blog and offer some other resources. You can check that out. And of course, subscribe to this podcast so that you don't miss an episode. And so other families will be able to find it and listen and get these resources and the encouragement and the inspiration that you were able to listen to today. Leave us a review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. And make sure you also follow us on social media, Sandra Flach and Justice for Orphans, both of us, both pages on Instagram and on Facebook. So please do check it out. And of course, you can follow the YouTube channel for Justice for Orphans, which all of the video versions of this podcast are posted. So check that out. Again, I'm so grateful that you spent your valuable time with me today. I am thrilled to have you along for the journey.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans. And check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.